This picture shows you the four major tissue types in the human body. There is epithelial tissue, which lines open spaces. I'm betting you're familiar with nervous tissue, such as the brain and the spinal cord. Nervous tissue is special because it conducts electricity. There's muscular tissue, which is specialized in contracting or creating force for movement. So, what then exactly is connective tissue? The name connective tissue doesn't really tell you what it is. This is kind of like that kitchen door that's like a cemetery for all odds and ends in your house. Connective tissue, well, it connects, I'm sorry, among other things. It's a really big category that has a lot of subcategories. For example, there's dense connective tissue, which makes up tendons and ligaments and connects bone to bone and muscles to bone. Connective tissue has other subcategories of supportive connective tissues like cartilage and bone. What's important for us here is the fact that all epithelial tissues line an open space on one side of cells and is connected to a connective tissue on the other side. For example, you live in a hard candy shell called your epidermis, which is made of epithelial tissue. Your epidermis doesn't like float on top of a gelatinous body stocking. It's actually like tacked down in certain areas to that gelatinous body stocking underneath, which we call the dermis. So when you spend too long in the bath, in the pool, in the lake, in the ocean, or whatever your preferred body of water may be, you don't actually shrivel when your fingers start to wrinkle. What's really happening is that your skin is bulging outward, and the valleys of those wrinkles are where your epidermis or epithelial tissue is tacked down to the dermis or the connective tissue below. The prefix epi means on top of, and so epithelial tissues are the tissues that lie on top of all of your others. Do you have open spaces in your body? No, but kind of. Many open spaces in your body, they're all filled with fluids. So they're not like open, really. Your trachea or your windpipe is kept open by cartilage so that air can flow to your lungs. But in contrast, your esophagus, it's a hollow tube, but it collapses when there's no food in it. Your bladder is also an open space. It's fluid filled, and then it collapses when no urine is in it. Most epithelial tissues in the body line fluid filled spaces. And you have to think of these fluid filled spaces as the open spaces. All epithelial tissues have some shared characteristics. It's all avascular, meaning there's no blood vessels. Epithelial tissue does not bleed. Have you ever put a safety pin into the very top layer of your skin? No blood, no vessels. Epithelial tissue also lacks nerves. That safety pin, it doesn't hurt. Having nerves is called innervated, and so epithelial tissue is not innervated. Your epithelial tissues also regenerate very quickly. You might be familiar with this about skin connecting to like dandruff or even a condition like psoriasis where there's too much mitosis forming plaques of those quickly shedding skin cells. But like the lining of your bladder, the lining of your small intestine, the lining of your stomach, they also continually divide. And this is why digestive and bladder cancers they're tough. Since epithelial tissues line open spaces, the cells have a top and a bottom to them. This picture on the left, it's a picture of the small intestine. And this open area in the center here is the lumen, or the space through which a food slurry would flow. So this is important. Whenever you're looking at a slide of epithelial tissue, you want to try to find the lumen or the open space. Plural of lumen is lumina. Epithelial in this picture here on the left, it's not magnified enough for us to see the individual cells. But the epithelial cells that line this lumen look a lot like this one that I have over here, right? And as you can see, this cell is coming from just a piece of this circular organ down here. So if I were to magnify it more, we can see a really thin layer of rectangular shaped cells lining the lumen. The side of these cells that is touching the lumen is called the apical surface. The bottom that is connected to the tissue underneath it is called the basal surface. And just a note here that connective tissue always underlies epithelial tissue. They come together and they meet up at the basal surface. So let's think of the bladder, nice and full with urine. The tissue that is pushed up against the urine is the epithelial tissue. The apical surface is the surface of the epithelial cells touching the urine. The basal surface is connected to the other flesh that's surrounding the bladder. Now think of a blood vessel or the heart with its open chambers. All of those things are lined with epithelial. Let's talk more about the lumen in a microscopic picture of epithelial tissues. This center picture here is from the anus, I believe, which is strikingly similar to your skin and is also continuous with your skin. This big white open area here is the lumen in this microscopic picture. The red colored layer of cells is dead epithelial cells sloughing off. And that purple layer is still epithelial cells, but it's a live layer. And that's why it looks very different and takes up the stain differently. The stain that we normally use is called an H&E stain and will color epithelial tissue red or purple. This picture up top here is an artery cross section. So an artery is like a tube. This circular area here in the center is the lumen. And it's a nice open area in that picture, but inside your body, it should be filled with blood. These pictures on the bottom, those are microscopic pictures that were taken with blood in an artery and a vein. You can see the little red blood cells. So maybe sometimes the lumen might not be a big white open space. It might have something in it, like blood. That's definitely something to think about when you're looking at microscopic pictures. It's so hard to see on the artery picture in the top. It's so hard to see this, but there is a very thin thread of purple stained cells lining that lumen. They're so thin that you can barely see them at the magnification that I've given you. But trust me, trust me. So magnification matters. You may not be able to see epithelial tissues until you get up close and personal. I might have to zoom in on a piece of the epithelial tissue. I might not be able to see the whole organ at once. And one last thing about lumina, which is the plural for lumen, there can be many in one picture. That's a little deceptive, right? This picture down here on the left is a picture of the kidney. And the kidney is just like a collection of drinking straws that you might like hold in your hand. And the kidney has many lumina. In fact, all of these open spaces here, these are all lumina. So there could be more than one lumen in one picture. Epithelial tissues come in three flavors with three toppings. Kidding. They come in three shapes and 2.5 layer types. What's nice is that their name reflects these qualities. So before you even start looking at a tissue, you can have an idea of what you should expect to see. Let's start with shape. The one shape most unfamiliar to students is this shape up top, the shape in the center, which is called the squamous shape. It's like a fried egg, round when you look at it from top down, but it's just a thin layer if you were to cut that fried egg and look at it from the side. So this fried egg shape is called squamous. The other two shapes are a lot more familiar, cuboidal and columnar. In practice, though, these can be difficult to tell apart, especially if they're smushed, which happens through the process of making a slide. The key might not be the shape, but it might be the position of the nucleus. In these cuboidal cells up top, the nucleus is right smack dab in the center of the cube. In columnar, it's all down on the bottom or basal surface. These shapes end up looking differently to you in a microscope than they do in real life. These shapes that are cuboidal just look like squares in the microscope. And these shapes down here that are supposed to represent columns, they look just like rectangles in the microscope. So what we see in the microscope is not what it looks like in your body. Okay, so those are the shapes, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. We can also get these shapes in one layer, which we call simple, or many layers, which we call stratified. The tissue on the very bottom is called stratified columnar. Unfortunately, we're going to meet a certain tissue called pseudostratified, but we'll look at that next. But this tissue here, it's stratified with 2 layers of cells, and I can easily define the 2 layers of nuclei. This tissue up here is stratified cuboidal, and I can easily identify 2 layers of cells and the layers of nuclei. And this picture in the center, it's more than 2 layers because stratified can be many layers. And these are squamous cells, and they have that flattened egg shape to them. Rules would not be rules without exceptions. And these 2 tissues here have definitions that put them outside of those rules of shape and layer. This top tissue is called pseudostratified because it looks stratified. It is not. All of the cells here are touching, the basal or basement membrane or the basal layer. All of these cells, each individual one, even with the nuclei that are up top, these are all touching the basement membrane. And this tissue is always called pseudostratified columnar. The other 2 shapes do not come pseudostratified. Only columnar comes pseudostratified. If there were little hairs, I'm sorry, I just coughed there. If there were little hairs hanging off the apical surface, then we would call this pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. What a name. The other exception is called transitional tissue. It's definitely stratified, right? It's got tons of layers, but you can see almost all 3 cell shapes here. So what do? Do you call this stratified apical squamous cuboidal basal columnar epithelia? No, that's not a real name. This tissue is called transitional, and it's found lining your urinary system, all of the parts of which have to stretch to accommodate urine. This picture that you see here is when these cells or this tissue is relaxed and holding no urine. If I stretch this tissue as urine enters the bladder, all of these cells will flatten. The columnar cells will look cuboidal, the cuboidals will look squamous, and the squamous cells will all look stretched out. If I stretch the bladder all the way to its limit, all of these cells will look like squamous cells. They'll be stretched so much, they will all look squamous. A telltale sign of transitional tissue are these dome-shaped cells on the apical surface. No other tissue has dome-shaped cells like this on their apical surface. Squamous cells line the cheeks of your mouth. Before COVID, we would take cheek swabs from students' mouths and make slides to view on the microscope. I'm sure they don't do that anymore. What you end up seeing, though, is cells that look like fried eggs. The nucleus stains a dark purple, which is kind of represented by the yolk of this egg. And the outline of the cell or the cell membrane, that also takes up a dark purple stain. So you end up seeing sheets of these cells kind of attached together, like this picture that I have in the center. And that's what you would see on a microscopic slide. But here's the problem. All of these pictures, or the ways that we're thinking of it, are 2D pictures. And squamous cells actually have a 3D shape, right? So when they exist all together, they're not completely flattened. They do have a third dimension to them. This cube starts to get you thinking about how tissues might actually look like in situ, that there's a 3D shape to how they're oriented.